Welcome back, guys, to the Disclosure Team YouTube channel. Just want to give a quick shout out to everybody in the live chat watching this live now. Hello to everybody on YouTube watching this after the fact. Thank you for tuning in. And to everybody listening to this on the Anomalous Podcast Network, I really appreciate you supporting the channel. I'm really excited for this conversation tonight. I last spoke to Dr. Clarke last year where he came on and we discussed the Calvine case. Since then, I've actually met up with David, had a great conversation and kept in touch. And now we're here to discuss some other instances and cases and some of his work with regards to the UFO cases in the UK. So let's not waste any more time, guys. Let's welcome Dr. David Clarke.
Hello.
David, how are you?
I'm fine. Good evening.
Thank you for joining me again.
Happy New Year.
Yes. Oh, I know. We got. It's funny, isn't it? It's nearly a month
later.
Yes. So, how are you? You good?
I'm fine. Yeah, I'm back at work, back teaching again, and still trying to sort of keep on top of what's going on in the UFO arena, which seems to be sort of changing and mutating every time I look at it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, there's a few major points I'd like to discuss with you tonight. I think, and I just mentioned this to you before we came on, I just popped a poll in the chat there to ask if anybody had heard of DI55. We're currently sitting at 74% are saying no. So I think a very good place to start is what is, or was, should I say, DI55?
Yeah, well, that is interesting in itself because it shows that the DI55's attempts to conceal itself, and it's always had this what it itself describes as a secret squirrel image. It seems to have worked quite well because basically they are or were the intelligence branch of the British military or Ministry of Defence, who were responsible for the investigation of UFOs. Now, most people will think that can't be right. What? Surely it was the UFO desk, and we've been told all these things over the years about how they were the central focus for the MOD and UFOs. But the paperwork, and there is literally masses of paperwork, shows that that is not the case, and we have some examples going back into the archives, which is my speciality and has been for the last 20 years. I mean, I started going to the National Archives, must have been, I think the first year I went there must have been 1997 or 1998. And that was the stage at which we still had the 30-year rule then. And I was going down there as a journalist looking not at UFO related materials, but they used to produce like a list on the 1st of January of what they were releasing. So in 1998, you'd be getting files from 1968. So a lot of the earlier UFO files had been destroyed, which is, honestly, I cannot describe how that makes me feel, having discovered that some of the really interesting files from that earlier period no longer exist. But the thing was, in 1998, we were finally getting to see some of the files that had survived from the late 1960s. And I was getting, part of my job was to go down and go through the files looking for material for the newspaper I was working for. And I just used to just ignore that, and I'd just sort of order up the UFO files. And it got into like quite a thing that I really enjoyed, and I got more and more into the minutiae of it. And you've been to the archives yourself, and you've ordered up files. It starts getting quite addictive. And,
it's good fun. It's fun as well. You feel something holding these documents in your hand. Yeah, it's amazing.
And that to me is proper research. I mean, and I don't regard sort of, as much as social media is amazing and it's transformed what we all do, there's only so much research you can do on Twitter or on WhatsApp or whatever. I just think you really if you really want to get to the bottom of this subject, you've got to immerse yourself in those documents, because and the thing is, as what I didn't just rely on the documents. I actually went through the documents with a fine-tooth comb, and I actually produced like masses and masses of spreadsheets and tracking down the people whose names appeared in those documents in the 1960s. And at that time, 1998, a lot of those people were still alive. Most of them have died subsequently, but a lot of the people who were involved in UFO investigations, quite a high level in the Ministry of Defence, were still alive in the late 90s when I started doing my research. And to me, it was because I did this as part of my job as a journalist. I just thought I just got a name from a document, John Carruthers. James Carruthers is a name that comes into my mind. He was the head of the Secretariat Air Staff branch that was responsible for UFOs in 1967. And you couldn't just go online back then and just type in his name and track it down. I had to look in Who's Who, which is like a huge printed volume civil service directory. And I found his name straight away in there and his phone number. I just phoned him up and said, "Are you the Jim Carruthers who used to be in charge of UFOs in the 1960s? And he was like, "Yeah. How did you find me?" And a couple of days later, I was sitting in his living room drinking coffee, and he was sort of talking without any restriction about, what he remembered about that time. So what I wanted to get to the bottom of was, did they investigate the subject? If they did, what did they discover? And who was it who did the UFO investigations? And it became pretty clear from very early doors that the people who had that interface with the general public, the desk that's since become known as the UFO desk.
Yeah.
And as you'll know, Vince, because you've seen the documents, it changed its name so many times. I mean, back in the 60s, it was known as S4 Air. It was originally S6 Air. Then it was S4 Air. And then it became DS8 about 1980. Then it changed to Secretariat Air Staff, which is the branch that Nick Pope briefly worked for. And finally, it ended up as something called DAS, Defence Air Secretariat or something. But what you quickly realize when you look at the files is they were the people who were acting as the public relations front. So they dealt with the subject in terms of if a member of the public wrote in asking about something or to report a sighting, you'd get a letter back from Secretariat Air Staff. And in the 1980s, when I was a teenager, I started writing to them, and a guy called Clive Neville, who he was doing the UFO desk job, and he wrote back to me. I'd got into quite a lengthy correspondence with him. But no one ever spoke directly to the people behind that desk. And all that material, you can see this from the files, has been copied to 2, 3, sometimes 4 separate different agencies within the Ministry of Defence, all through the 60s, all through the 70s, all through the 80s, and up to the turn of the century. And they included, there was a branch called, again, which changed its name, which is part of the Royal Air Force, that was responsible for ground and air radar. So basically, if there was an evidential sighting, they were copied the material, and basically it would be, can you check at this time, date, location, direction, did you have anything unusual on radar? That was their task. And at various times, these different branches, depending upon who was there and their level of interest in the subject, they could sort of like assume the lead, if you see what I mean. Yeah. It's difficult to explain, but if like you had a complete skeptic sitting in SecAS who just thought this is a waste of time, waste of money, I don't want anything to do with it, they would sort of recede into the distance. And then if someone from the RAF was more interested in it, or someone from DI55 had a personal interest in it, they were the ones who did most of the work until they moved on, because the people doing this job did it usually for about 3 or 4 years, like Nick Pope, and then went on to another post. You see what I mean? So you've got this sort of like interface going on all the time. But despite all what I've said, when you actually look at the actual documents, it's very clearly said right from 1967 that SecAS acts as the focal point. They almost like a triage sort of system. Like if you went into hospital with an injury, you're looked at by a nurse, and the nurse says, "Oh, right, you can go into this ward, or you might need to see a consultant." So basically, SecAS were acting as the triage section of the Ministry of Defence. and they didn't want nosy parkers like ufologists and journalists, sort of getting beyond that brick wall. So it was like, and even members of parliament, when there were questions in parliament, SECAS dealt with that. But when you actually look at the archives, again, as you've done, Vince, you will see virtually everything that they said publicly, like when they were responding to a parliamentary inquiry. They didn't just create it out of nowhere. Everything was referred to DI55, particularly when it was something technical, like when you got a question, how many UFOs have been seen on radar in 1984? Well, SECAS has a clue. So it's like, well, we'll go and ask the RAF, or we'll go and ask DI55. They've got all the data. So they were the people who did the investigations as well. I mean, and I know it caused great controversy last year when I was asked about Nick Pope and UFO investigation. I simply said he didn't investigate anything. And I stand by that statement, because a lot depends on how you interpret the word investigation. Now, the people who ran SECAS simply weren't, it wasn't part of their tasks to actually investigate. Yeah, they did refer reports to these other agencies to check whether things were seen on radar, to check whether there were anything unusual about it. But if I did an investigation as a journalist, I would phone someone up, I would go out, I would visit the site, I would speak to them, I'd interview them, I'd put all this stuff together. That's an investigation. And no one from SECAS ever did that. They did it as part of a team. And that's the last time that was done properly, from what I can gather from the files, was in 1967, because there was a big UFO flap in 1967 in October, and I think they had something like 300 or 400 sightings in the space of a few months, and there was a huge amount of press interest. And Jim Carruthers, who's the guy I was talking about, who was the head then of S4 Air, who I interviewed, he basically assembled this. I mean, you could almost call it an X-Files team, because that's what it was. So there was him. There was the guy who was doing Nick Pope's job at the time. There was a guy from DI55 who was a scientist called, I can't remember his name now, but it's in the files. And another guy who was a RAF psychologist called Alex Casey, who I interviewed before he died quite recently. And Alex Casey is an interesting character, because if you've seen the film The Great Escape,
of course,
the character that's played by Donald Pleasance, who is the forger, he creates all the forged documents so they can escape the Nazi. That was based upon Alex Casey. So he was quite a famous wartime prisoner of war who went into psychology, and he worked in the RAF, training pilots, to overcome some of the hazards that they experience. And he got into UFOs because he was part of this RAF science section. So he was part of this team that actually went out and did field investigations, which is something they have never done again since the 1960s. And they actually went out and interviewed close encounter witnesses and all the
members of the public.
Yeah.
Wow. Proper boots on the ground.
Yeah, they did proper investigations, and they were properly funded to do that. So, I mean, if you want to put up the first document,
absolutely.
This is from I think that's the second one. Is it? No, it isn't. No, this is the first one. So
that's the first one. Yeah.
This is an actual document created by a guy called Eric Humpston, and he was the DI55 UFO officer. Quite a title, in 1967. And DI55 is a branch of the Defence Intelligence Staff. And the thing is, what you need to understand about this is the modern MOD didn't exist until about 1962. So after the Second World War, there was a Ministry of Defence, but it was a tiny little sort of thing compared to what it is today. So what you had was 3 different branches of the armed forces in the UK. So you had the Royal Air Force, Royal Navy, and the Army, effectively.
Yeah.
They all had their own intelligence branches. So when they started investigating UFOs, or flying saucers as they were originally known in the early 1950s, it was after a bit of initial confusion, you know, there was that study that was done for Winston Churchill in the 1950s. We haven't got the time to go into that, but
next time.
Yeah, next time maybe. The MOD were in charge of doing a study of UFOs, then an intelligence study, but they basically said we don't need to look at it anymore. And then there was a very evidential sighting, which I think is one of the best UFO reports from the UK ever. Which some of your listeners may be aware of, the Top Cliff sighting at RAF Top Cliff in North Yorkshire. In September 1952, it was a daylight disc that followed a meteor jet during a NATO exercise. It was seen by a whole crowd of RAF airmen from the ground and tracked on radar as well, I understand. And basically that overturned this earlier sort of dismissal of the subject. And that led the Air Ministry to set up effectively the UFO desk, as it then was, but it was under the Air Ministry from the early 1950s until the mid 1960s, and that's when basically I think it was under Lord Mountbatten. They said we can't have three different services running the MOD. We need to combine them all. So the Air Ministry, the Navy, and the Army, all their intelligence sections came together. And that's where the Defence Intelligence Staff came into being. It existed before, but all the combined three services came under one sort of MOD department, which was known as DSTI. So you can see DSTI on that document there. So up to 1967, it was a branch of the Air Ministry called the Air Tech Intelligence Branch, which I think is mentioned in there somewhere, that was responsible for UFO investigations. And at that time, apparently, they had people working on this full time. You know, so they had military Air Ministry intelligence officers whose entire responsibility was to investigate UFOs. You know, that's something that hasn't been the case ever since the 1960s, but it was then. So in 1967, and this is the document from the National Archives that shows when this happened, they transferred the responsibility for UFO investigations from the Air Ministry. That, as you can see, these investigations were originally carried out by Tech Intelligence Air, but they became the responsibility of the space section in DI55 from the beginning of May 1967. And you can see there, as it says very, very clearly, that when UFO sightings come in, they go to S4F Air, and that is the UFO desk where Nick Pope worked 2 or 3 decades later. Basically, they were the triage. They were the people who sort of received the reports and copied them straight away to all these different branches. And it's there on the distribution list. And it says very clearly there, in the cases where there is no immediate satisfactory explanation that can be determined, for instance, these are truly unidentified flying objects. So this is what we're interested in, folks, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
Then DSTI are required by MOD to carry out further investigations. It's there in black and white. And if we go to the next document...
Can I just ask a question about that quickly? With regards to S4 Air, they're the ones you say that pass it off. You know, they're the triage people. And that's where Nick Pope worked. After the investigations have been done by whoever they passed it off to, do S4 Air then get the conclusive data that's been put together?
Good question. Answered by your next document.
Oh,
the answer to that.
Fantastic.
So if we go to this one and you can expand that. This is a guy, this is the bloke who took over the reins from Jim Carruthers in the 1960s, a bloke called James Peduzzi, who I wasn't able to track down despite his very striking, unusual surname. And he wrote quite a lot about UFOs. He seemed to be quite into the subject. And as you can see, this is like an extract from quite a lengthy memo that he circulated around all these top brass at the MOD in 1977. And 1977 was a big year for UFOs as well. There was all the sightings in Wales, you know, the Welsh Triangle, the sighting by those school children at Broadhaven that's constantly keeps recurring. The David Davis, one of the schoolboys, he's become a bit of a celebrity now. And the interesting thing was, it was seeing Seeing that on John Craven's news round when I was 10 years old, and seeing those kids being interviewed, and they were the same age as me, they were all 10, that got me into UFOs.
Wow.
Right, all those years ago. But interestingly enough, you look at the files that survive on this, and this document is actually talking about the West Wales sightings. And Peduzzi is saying, we've had lots of inquiries about these Welsh sightings, and we've actually asked the Air Force's police to make a discreet investigation of what's been going on in Wales, basically. And he doesn't actually say what the result of that investigation was. And he says that this is something that they're trying to keep quiet, and they haven't even told the local MP that that's what they're doing.
Wow.
So they basically sent an undercover team of RAF police officers to West Wales to investigate undercover, and didn't tell the local MP who had actually raised the subject with them in the first place. And you can see here, he's trying to explain to his managers and to ministers how they go about investigating this subject. And he says it's always possible that he's saying we get all these nuts writing to us and all these sort of weirdos and what have you, but we don't really want to engage with these people, but we can't ignore the subject. And as he says, despite the considerable correspondence addressed to the MOD, we can't ignore it because there might be something in there, like a pearl in an oyster.
Oh yeah.
Hiding somewhere in the noise, that there might be something, like he says there, with hostile terrestrial origin, which could have a bearing on national security. He's obviously talking about the Russians.
Yeah.
That's the only conclusion you can make. We have therefore been careful to refer all UFO inquiries from the public to AD DI55. AD is basically the person who is DI55, because that would be the Assistant Director of Defence Intelligence Staff Branch 55. So there's a person who's a scientist or a military. Some of them were from the RAF, some were from the Royal Navy, some were just scientists who did that job. And the other one you can see there, DD Ops, GERAF, is the RAF branch I was talking about earlier. That's Ground Environment RAF. So the people who basically sit at a huge bank of computers that are receiving live feed from the radar stations around the East Coast. So they're watching a live picture, everything approaching the UK, they see it on radar. So they're the other branch. So there were the two branches that were sent UFO reports for further investigation, which they might consider to be justified. Now, the interesting line to answer your question, Vinny, is as a secretariat branch, i.e. we are civilians who don't have top secret clearance, S4 Air does not need to know about this type of inquiry, and we do not ask for further information. We tell the public flatly that we cannot enter into detailed correspondence, and all inquiries, we don't take it any further. So basically saying we just send this stuff to DI55. They've got the responsibility. If they think it's worth following up, they get on with it. We don't want to know what they do, basically. And again, that underlines what was laid down in writing 10 years before this in the earlier memo that you've just seen. So the obvious question is, what on earth did they do with all this stuff?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, yeah, that's a good point. Where was that? Maybe that's in some of the stuff they destroyed.
Yes. Yeah, because what you need to understand from this is, at the time these people were writing these documents, there was no such thing as the Freedom of Information Act.
Of course.
The Freedom of Information Act basically didn't come into UK law until the late 1990s, and it was like massively resisted by all the military and intelligence people. They didn't want to even engage with it at all. So if you can sort of like put yourself into the minds of these people who were writing in 1967 and 1977, they thought that what they were putting down, no one outside of that little bubble would ever read it. So the fact that we are sitting here now in 2022 reading this basically is amazing, because a lot of the earlier stuff went in the incinerator. Yeah, and it's only because now they're not allowed to destroy this material that we're actually reading it.
Yeah. I just wanted to address this quick comment here. K42D says, why does he assume it's the Russians? Well, I think what it says, if it's of a hostile terrestrial origin, then it's going to be an adversary, basically.
Yeah.
So Russian, Chinese, and whoever.
Well, yeah.
So it
To
was
be
kind
fair,
of a broad vague.
to be fair, they could be referring to the Chinese, But I mean, who are the enemy? Who were the enemy in 1967?
Exactly.
It was the Soviet Union, which still existed at that time.
Of course. So it's not really an assumption, more of just it's not extraterrestrial. We're talking about the possibility of it being terrestrial, adversarial. And this kind of mirrors what we're seeing, that nowadays, what we see out of the Pentagon with this potential threat narrative. It could be adversarial technology. It could be off-world technology. It almost mirrors that with regards to that statement.
Yeah, and there was a lot of quite embarrassing things that they were trying to hide, and one of the main ones that's become apparent to me is basically their radar cover was rubbish. That basically the radars were looking out towards the North Sea, because that's where they expected any threat to be seen approaching the UK, because this is the Cold War, and they were totally focused on the enemy as they saw it, the Soviet Union, and they thought that if anything's going to be seen on radar, it's going to be coming over the Arctic, which is where the Russian planes still do this, don't they? They fly over, they test our defenses. And unfortunately, a lot of the UFO sightings, which they were asked to investigate, were sightings of things over land, over the UK. And what you see is all this embarrassing sort of correspondence between the different branches saying, well, our radar wasn't working that night, or we don't have any cover over north of England after 9 p.m. because someone switches it off and goes home.
I came across some articles in the archives myself where a lot of reports were being thrown to RAF Fylingdale saying, did you guys see this and that, and all these cases? Like, it was, I didn't expect to see that. I really didn't.
This is if there is a cover-up, this is the source of the cover-up, because they are embarrassed about some of this stuff. They don't want us to know how poorly defended we were and what a chaotic sort of bureaucratic system was in place. So that, I mean, like you see this with the Rendlesham incident, in that, that if something was hovering over Suffolk that night in 1980, then, and if Colonel Holt really thought that this thing was threatening a NATO base, then why didn't he get on the blower to, RAF Neaty said, and say, there's a UFO over one of our most sensitive bases. Get those fighters in the sky.
Scramble them now.
Yeah. He didn't do it, or he wasn't taken seriously. So there's somewhere along the line, basically, they messed up. And that's what they're trying to cover up. It's the ignorance and incompetence, and it's embarrassing. So it's easier to just destroy the evidence than it is to admit that, sorry, we had the radar switched off that night. That's the inconvenient truth.
And the base commander doesn't take a hit.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So I can't remember what the next document was, but I'm sure it's something interesting.
Let's get it up.
We're moving now towards. This is just another. If such proof was needed. Now, this is a chap that I've spoken to. He was in charge of the DI50. He was the DI55 UFO officer in the late 1970s. And again, he got an unusual surname of Astaraki. So it didn't take me long to track him down. And he was more than willing to talk to me, despite the fact that, the problem you have with these DI people is they've all signed the Official Secrets Act. They've been told under no circumstances are you to speak to members of the public, and especially not journalists, about what you did when you were working for the MOD. And let's be serious about this. These people, I can understand why they are sensitive about being interviewed, because these people were up to some pretty secretive stuff, espionage, doing undercover work in the Soviet Union. And it's like, do we really want to sort of expose them to a potential enemy, given, what we've seen has happened in Salisbury with the scribbles and that kind of thing. I don't want to do that. But I still think that they shouldn't be told that under no circumstances should they speak about anything, because to be honest, the UFO part of their responsibility, which was tiny, it was just something they inherited. That a lot of them thought, why on earth are we having to do this? It's not sensitive. It never was sensitive. It's not like, ballistic missiles, and they don't want the Russians to know what we know about them, etc., etc. It's just that some of these people who were responsible for UFOs, they had extremely sensitive responsibilities in other areas, which quite rightly fall under the Official Secrets Act. And this is the problem with the guy who did the Condign study, Ron Haddo, that undoubtedly he's been told, don't speak, and particularly don't speak to Dr. Clarke, because he's all over the internet. But I have spoken to some of the people who work with him and some of his successors. And this guy, as you can see, the reason I brought this one up, this is a signal, which is almost like a teletype. Long before there was Twitter and social media, different intelligence agencies in different countries would communicate with each other by these teletypes, which you've probably seen, in some of these 1970s TV shows where they've got these huge computers that are churning out all these printer pages that are stacking up on the floor. So late 1978, there was this flap of sightings in New Zealand. Quite often they show a little segment about it in UFO documentaries. And again, I distinctly remember, how old would I have been then? Probably about 15 or 16. New Year's Eve, and we never get serious news coverage of UFO sightings in this day and age. I mean, the front page of the Daily Star, which I put on Twitter.
Oh, don't.
That nonsense about people outside public houses more likely to see UFOs. I mean, that's what depths of that journalism has fallen to, so-called journalism now. But I mean, back in the 70s, it did get serious coverage. And I remember the top news item on New Year's Eve, 1978, was UFOs have been filmed circling a Argosy freighter aircraft flying between North Island and South Island in New Zealand, and they've been seen on radar, some spectacular footage, some of which has never been fully explained. And basically, it caused a huge panic in this country. On the other side of the world, there were questions in Parliament. This was just before there was a full day's debate in the House of Lords, believe it or not, a whole day dedicated to UFOs in the House of Lords.
What?
Oh, yeah, early January 1979. And the guy who was in charge of DI55, he was very, very busy, shall we say, advising his opposite number in the UFO desk about what on earth should we say. So he was firing out these teletypes to different parts of the world, and he'd sent this to his opposite number in Wellington, New Zealand. As you can see, restricted, January 1979, and he's basically saying, hello, New Zealand, this is John Staraki, ADI, DI55, so that's Assistant Director of Intelligence, Defence Intelligence Staff 55, Branch 55. Subject, recent UFO sightings in New Zealand. Within MOD UK, DI55 is responsible for investigating UFOs. There we go, folks. It's not the UFO desk that's sending the teletype to New Zealand, it's DI55. So basically saying, is there anything in these sightings? Can you tell us urgently? Because we've got this debate in the House of Lords coming up, and we need to know what to say, basically. So again, that just underlines late 1970s. Again, the investigations, the actual proper inquiries, not just the fobbing off, the stonewall. That was what SECAS did. Behind the scenes, DI55 were the people who were doing the actual groundwork, the shoe leather, I would call it. So I just wanted to bring that one up because, again, there it is in black and white.
Absolutely.
My mum used to say, what can't speak, can't lie, although it can't be interpreted. And I spoke to the author of that, spoke to him about 10 years ago, and he confirmed, I was responsible for UFO investigations. for about 4 or 5 years. I'd spent a lot of time on it, even though it was only a small percentage of my responsibility, about 20% of my workload. But he basically said, I did all the work on it. And the guy in SecAS just copied stuff to me. I was the one who phoned up the radar stations. I was the one who sent them teletypes. I was the one who had access to top secret information. They didn't. So
says it all. Says it all.
Document, and we've got the testimony from the person who wrote that document. What more do you need?
Yeah.
So moving swiftly on, what's the next?
Where are we? I'm gonna just take a bathroom break while you jump into this next one. I'll still be able to hear though. So here we go.
I'm gonna have a swig of my lubricant here, the bit of beer. Oh yeah, this is my favorite document of all, and I think Vinny would need to expand it to actually well, he will do when he gets back. And this is a memo that was put together by the guy who was the DI55 or DI55C, as he calls himself. I know the identity of this person. He was the opposite number to Nick Pope. Back in 1993-94, he was, what shall we say, a member of the armed forces. I'm not going to say any more than that. I've had some long chats with him about this subject. And again, he was the one who said he did the investigations. And you might ask, what happened to all their findings? What, all these years that they'd been sort of investigating this subject and building up this database, what happened to all that? And we get to the mid-1990s, and there's more and more interest in the subject, and the media are just going mad about UFOs. We're building up to the 50th anniversary of Roswell, Kenneth Arnold sighting, the birth of ufology. There are films like Independence Day featuring UFOs, featuring Roswell as one of its main themes. You've got the X-Files on TV. Massive interest, MPs asking questions in Parliament, and the UFO desk just keeps stonewalling. It says, we don't investigate this subject. We never have investigated it. This is what they're saying publicly. But behind the scenes, DI55 are saying, well, if it turns out that UFOs do exist, or UAPs, as they then called them, because we all talk about UAPs now, don't we? But to give DI55 their due, they were the people who started using UAP before anyone else, even before ufologists. So if you look into their files, they start referring to UFOs as UAPs around 1992, 93. And they even get into a battle of words with the UFO desk, because the UFO desk is saying, what's this UAP thing you keep mentioning? And basically they're saying, well, that's what we prefer to use, because UAP is talking about aerial phenomena. It's not talking about UFO, i.e. object, because we don't know that these things are objects, that they're solid objects. There's some kind of, they're moving towards this sort of thing about them being atmospheric, plasmas. Yeah, right. Their favorite explanation. And basically they're saying, if these things actually do exist, let's say there's some big incident where maybe an aircraft is brought down from the sky, collides with one of these things. Naturally, we're going to be in the spotlight, because the government and the public and the media are going to say, you say you've been monitoring this subject. There's nothing to worry about. What you say, why weren't you aware of this? So they're saying we're in a really tricky position here, because some of these things do appear to have some solid evidence. They talk about the Rendlesham incident. They talk about some others that are less well known. We need to do a study. So all through the 90s, this chap, this DI55C, is piling pressure on his manager, the head of Defence Intelligence Staff, saying, for God's sake, let's spend some money on this. I know you're telling the public we're not studying it, and it's bad PR if it turns out that we are, because we're going to get loads of press and media attention, but we've got to do something. So all through the 90s, he was making like what you would call a business case all we want to do, this guy was saying, is let's set up a basic computer program where we can start inputting some of these thousands and thousands of reports that we've had come in during the 1970s and 1980s. And honestly, you can see what actually became of this in the Condign Report. It's to put it, the only word you can use to describe it is crap. Because it was basically, I mean, I've got students doing dissertations at university who've done a better job than they did. And they managed to squeeze £30,000 out of the chief of defence intelligence for this study. And they gave it to this contractor. Well, let's say who it is. It's Ron Haddo, who basically was the MOD's UFO expert. And now he'd been interested in the subject on and off since the 1950s. He'd worked in DI55. His expertise was radar. Now, this is Ron Haddo, now in his 80s. He'd had a sighting of his own whilst he was flying a Canberra jet in a top secret mission over the Soviet Union in the 1950s. And he'd reported it to the Air Ministry at that time in the 1950s. That is all we know, because he has never spoken about this. He just mentioned it in one of his memos. And he was obviously, whenever there was a UFO that defied explanation, he was the person they went to. And I think he must have known R.V. Jones, you know, the famous wartime expert that Churchill used to turn to for advice.
Yeah.
He was interested in UFOs as well. They all knew each other, these people.
I'd be interested to know if Ron Haddo's sighting was more Foo Fighter sort of esque, or if it was more Kenneth Arnold, disc, Roswell-y kind of solid object. That's fascinating. But like you say,
it's fascinating. And
we don't
how
know.
frustrating. We are never going to know the details of that, because it obviously was in the 1950s and all those documents have been destroyed. And the reason we know those documents have been destroyed is in the files themselves. When Ron Haddo was given the contract to write the Condign Report, basically he had sort of access to all the surviving top secret files on UFOs that was stored at that time in the bowels of the Defence Intelligence Building, Northumberland Road in central London. And he writes about it in the background material to the Condign Report. He says, I went looking for these early files, and he spent ages combing through filing cabinets and presumably trying to find his own report from the 1950s. And someone at some point in the 1980s, for reasons known only to themselves, decided, why are we keeping all these UFO reports? Let's just burn them. And so they destroyed everything. So there was nothing when he actually got in to see the top secret files. The earliest ones he could find there was a few that had survived from the mid 1970s. Nothing else. So the actual file sequence starts up sort of mid 1980s. So when he started inputting this material into his Excel spreadsheet, he basically starts in 1987. So he does like a 10-year run from 1987 to 1997, because everything before that he couldn't find. It's gone. Someone's destroyed it. And he had access that no one else is going to have. He had basically a free rein to go and look through all the top secret material. So all those really evidential cases that might have actually, if he'd had access to that stuff, he might have written a much better report. You know, the Topcliffe sighting, the Lake and Heath Bentwaters sightings from the 1950s, the Rendlesham, whatever there was on Rendlesham, all he ever saw was Colonel Holt's memo, which doesn't really tell the story, does it? But that's all he saw.
Yeah, and true.
So he could only work on what was available, because he was working in this secret squirrel organization. He wasn't allowed to talk to anyone outside the MOD, wasn't allowed to talk to ufologists, wasn't allowed to go and interview witnesses, and he was basically told, go off and write a report, and here's £30,000.
Wow.
And
you just mentioned a few years there that are ringing bells for me, because I just wrote an article about the 1955 Bexley Heath case. Are you familiar with that one?
I'm not actually, no.
Oh, okay, that's all right. I wasn't sure if there was something off the top of your head you were like, oh yeah, I know that, because I struggle to find much data or information on it. That's all.
Well, you won't, because what you find in the files, and you've probably seen this, Vinny, is there is letter after letter after letter from people saying, some of them ex-military, saying, I saw a flying saucer when I was stationed, I don't know, in Hong Kong in 1952. And I made an official report to the Air Ministry about it. Have you got it? And the response is, sorry, no.
I saw a lot of that. Yeah, I saw a
Yeah.
lot of that. And it's funny, I'll just say this right now to everyone watching and listening, is when we were there, we actually find little slips with David's name in the files as well, because he'd obviously been through them so many times and that they'd just been left in there. And I thought that was brilliant.
I mean, when I get into something, and I got really into pursuing this DI55 lead, I'm like a dog with a bone, and you find in some of the later things, it's like, oh my God, it's him again, you know, he won't leave us alone, sort of thing. And I just thought, well, no, well, you're being paid to do this job, you know, and you can't get away from the fact that we now have freedom of information, although they've now taken freedom, effectively killed off freedom of information. I had this little window of opportunity from about 1999 to about 2006, when the drawbridge was pulled down, you know, where you could actually ask them for things, be very specific. What files have you got on this subject? And they would actually go and look, and if they found something, they'd copy it, and you'd get it within a few days. You know, anyone who's tried to use FOI to get information on UFOs today will know that era has come to an end. And there was a period in from about 2000 to about 2006 where I was virtually in almost like daily contact with the person who ran the UFO desk at that point, and Linda Unwin, she was called, and she had basically she was the Freedom of Information officer, but about 50% of her time was spent dealing with inquiries about UFOs. So I spoke to her on the phone. I was invited down to the Ministry of Defence in London on 2 occasions to meet her and her boss, Rob Lingham, who was sort of like the head of that department. Spent about 2 hours there asking them, talking to them. I saw the UFO desk. It just looked like an ordinary desk. There was no I think at one point I said, "Where's the dead aliens and where you're hiding them?" And it was, you know, and they answered all my questions in an honest, straightforward way. I don't think they were hiding anything, because I don't think they knew anything more than what they knew. And then I sort of, having done all this research, I'd basically come across a reference to a study that had been done by the Defence Intelligence Staff, which we now know to be the Condign Report. And I waited until the 1st of January 2005, which was the day that Freedom of Information arrived. And I wrote straight away, I did warn her. I said, you're going to get something from me in the post. And I said, right, you know, I know that Defence Intelligence Staff did a study, funded study of this subject towards the end of the 1990s. I'd like to see a copy of it, please. And it was almost like you could hear the sort of, we know he's going to ask for this. And they went off, and they discovered, to their own surprise, that this study had actually been done without them being told. And this was the thing that stunned me, because here we are, this so-called UFO desk that's supposedly the focal point of all public inquiries on the subject. They didn't know anything about the fact that Defence Intelligence Staff, DI55, had been given £30,000 to £50,000 of public money. They'd created this huge computer database. This guy had spent about 5 years going through all this material, produced this enormous report, copy of which I have here. And after about 6 months of, oh my God, what are we going to say to him? I got an email saying, well, would you like to come down to London to collect a copy of it? And I was sort of, you are pulling my leg. And it was like, no, come down. You know, we'll have to sort of vet you, and you'll have to go through all these security checks and what have you. So I just racked up on Trafalgar Square one morning. Joe McGonigal, you may have come across his name. He was an active UFO researcher at the time. He came down with me.
Yeah.
We got in, and basically I was presented with a brown envelope containing the Condign study. And honestly, I took this out and sat in a coffee shop. It must have been for about 5 hours going through it. I just could not believe my eyes that here it was, you know, the Holy Grail. And I've got to say, I mean, we did a press conference. There was a massive media coverage, and ufology was absolutely hostile. You know, it was, you know, why have they given this to him? Is it some kind of, you know, is he really working for them? You know, is it some kind of huge whitewash? And like now, all of a sudden, Condign study, it's like everybody wants to know about it. It's wonderful, you know, this, that, and the other. But at the time in 2006, all I got was just hostile reaction from ufologists. And it was simply because the report doesn't say, yes, UFOs exist and they are aliens, basically. That's all people wanted to hear.
Yeah.
Or, to me, that whatever you think about the extraterrestrial thing, what was important to me is the report says UFOs exist. There's no doubt about it, and we don't know what they are. Surely that, at the time I was saying, isn't that interesting?
Absolutely. I mean, and let's be clear that there's not many copies of that, is there?
No.
Like physical copies.
No, I mean, you can download it, I think, online. I think although it's not on the MOD's website. I think if there's a link which, if anybody wants to download it,
I'll pop it in the live chat right now. I've got it lined up.
It's the National Archives page, isn't it? You know, the National Archives sort of like create sort of like they like to try and keep things that have been placed online that have since been removed. They've got like an archive of those things, so you can download the whole thing. But as far as I'm aware, I possess only one of 2 actual copies of the report, and it's enormous. I mean, volume 2 is just, you know, you could use this as a doorstop. It's so thick. And this is the one that contains all the like scientific like papers on different scientific subjects that Ron Haddo thought had relevance to UAP. So I've just put little stickies in here for ease of reference. And so there's like one section that talks about the Rendlesham incident, plasma effects on humans. There's a whole section on radar, which was his speciality. I mean, the interesting thing about Ron Haddo is Dr. Ron Haddo, and I looked into what his PhD was, what subject it was on. I actually downloaded a copy of his PhD the other day and had a good read through it. And it was about how radar can detect unidentified objects flying at low level over inland outside radar coverage. And he did that for the University of Loughborough as a PhD in the 1980s. So again, isn't it an interesting coincidence that the man who wrote this report was writing his PhD on how the military can detect effectively unidentified flying objects on radar? So he talks about that in this volume 2. He talks about exotic technology. He talks about the section, I love this section on Black Project aircraft. And we won't get into the Calvine report again, but there's a whole section of this where he talks about friendly aircraft that people wouldn't necessarily recognize as conventional aircraft that are sent by foreign, sometimes friendly nations that fly over the UK. And there's a whole page that's just blank, you know, with a big line through it, section 26 and section 27.
Oh, just redacted.
Yeah, because it's sensitive intelligence that's been shared with the Americans. So in volume, I think it might be volume 1 or volume 3, there's a picture of something that they don't want us to see, which will be one of these huge triangular stealthy objects like what was seen in Calvi. So it's basically all there. But the bizarre thing about the Condign study is he comes up with this bizarre theory that these things exist. They move at incredible speed. They land. They have effects on people and on animals, and they leave marks on the ground, and this, that, and the other. They're very extremely rare phenomena, but he basically says there's no evidence that any of them have ever crashed. They never left any traces, radiation traces. They've never. There's no electronic intelligence. There's no signals intelligence about them. But clearly they exist, and he
Yeah.
reaches the conclusion that it's some kind of natural plasma energy that exists in our atmosphere, in the lower atmosphere, in the upper atmosphere as well, that is occasionally seen by pilots. And he says basically there are all these sightings by pilots, and it's probably plasma that they're seeing that looks metallic, that looks like a solid object, but it's actually just I mean, what is plasma? I made some notes about this earlier. I mean, just going online on Wikipedia, plasma, one of the 4 fundamental states of matter. Basically, it's ionized gas. And his theory was basically you've got meteorites that are impacting on the atmosphere that are creating this ionized gas, like the aurora borealis.
Absolutely, yeah.
But basically, there's some of these plasmas that are actually surviving, that are buoyant plasmas, he calls them, or dusty plasmas, and they sort of suck all this sort of stuff into the plasma. And you can see how somebody might see one of these things and they see all this stuff whirling around inside. And if they're seen in daylight, they might appear to be metallic or reflective. And that's how people get this idea about them being disc-shaped. The problem with this is it's not scientific. You could not find a scientist who would sort of say, yeah, there are these amazing plasmas that are created in the atmosphere that come down to the ground that people see as UFOs. I mean, to me, as much as I like the idea, and I think it might explain some of the more puzzling cases, to me, it's just like, and I said this on that Channel 5 program, which they just cut to ribbons, and just the bits they used. I basically said that I like it, the idea. It sounds interesting, and it's an alternative to the extraterrestrial hypothesis. But it's got no more evidence than it sounds scientific, but it's nonsense. Where's the evidence for it? You know, and if you speak to plasma physicists, as I have done, I mean, Jenny Randalls is very keen on sort of suggesting that what PC Alan Godfrey saw, the flying saucer in Todmorden, was one of these plasmas. Now, nice idea, but if you talk to a plasma physicist, something that big that he described that was sitting there in front of him, if that was a plasma, he'd have been basically fried alive. I mean, this thing is like nuclear energy.
Yeah, like radiation,
It wouldn't just leave a bit of a swirl on the floor. You know, I'm not surprised that he lost consciousness, because you probably would confronted by something like that. But I think he'd have been a bit warmer than what he was that night if it was a plasma. I mean, I like it, but I'm sorry, it doesn't stack up. I think it was just Ron Haddow's personal sort of muse, and he got this money. And despite the fact that he says in the report that he didn't want to get sucked into media and ufology, he wanted to keep himself out of that altogether. He just wanted to look at the evidence in the way that you would as a member of a jury in a Crown Court trial.
Sure.
But having said that, you read through the report, and then he starts referring to Paul Devereaux's book Earthlights and Jenny Randall's this, and you think, this is the guy that said he's not going to get immersed in ufology. So quite clearly, he'd read all the same books that I'd read, and he's actually got one of my books on his list. And he'd obviously read all this stuff and thought, Earthlights, so as well as plasmas, some of these things could be, like ufologists are saying, you know, these lights in Hessdalen in Norway that they think are created by geological forces, you know, sort of creating this piezoelectricity. Yeah, maybe, but where's the evidence?
That's exactly where I'm going to Colombia in a week and a half to investigate a phenomenon that happens there that is exactly the same. It's plasma, possibly based. It's on top of a mountain in something that almost mirrors Hessdalen. So I just want to raise this question here from Eve Clancy to say thank you for the $5 donation. But Eve says, how prominent have MIB experiences historically been in the UK? After the Wales School UFO, a local woman reportedly had a visit from 2 MIBs.
Well, well, I've spoken to one of those 2 MIBs that visited that lady.
Wow. Bombshell.
I think the person she's referring to there is a lady called Rosa Granville, I think she was called, and she ran a hotel which still exists on the west coast of Wales. And on one night in 1977, this was part of the West Wales flat, she saw what she thought was a flying saucer. I don't know whether she saw it come down or it was already there. And there was two guys, or one guy, I can't remember, was dressed in like a silver suit that was standing, examining the ground or collecting samples or something. And again, she reported it to the local airbase, which was RAF Brawdy, which there was a top secret US naval base that was part of RAF Brawdy at the time, who were up to doing top secrety things. So there was some local speculation that they might have been involved. Anyway, you know, the document we saw earlier, written by that guy called John Paduzzi, where he talks about having made some discreet inquiries in Wales. Well, he basically sent an RAF police team, and I know I spoke to the guy who was the squadron leader at RAF Brawdy at the time, and he remembered being asked to go and speak to Rosa Granville. So he was one of the men in black, basically, that turned up, who were from the military, and talked to
Wow.
us.
Wow. Dave here, Shadows of Your Mind, says Haven Fort Hotel in Little Haven.
That's the one, Haven Fort Hotel, and I think they're still open. And I think if you want to do sort of like a UFO themed sort of holiday in Wales, they still have like UFO memorabilia in the hotel, and you can sort of stay there and you can visit some of the places. You know, Broadhaven School, where the famous landing was, is literally sort of like a 5-minute drive away. And it's
I'm making a note of that right now.
Yeah, highly recommended. So we know who the MIB were. And despite the fact that the government denied that they actually sent people out to do these investigations, they did. There's no doubt about it. It's there in the records. I mean, some of these so-called MIB were actual ufologists who were, you know, there are people who like to pretend that they work for the Secret Service, aren't they? That sort of not beyond sort of knocking on somebody's door and saying, "I work for the government. Tell me about your UFO sighting." But some of them were genuinely RAF DI55 people, because we know they were doing field investigations in the 60s and 70s.
So Dave's saying here as well, there 2 MIBs allegedly turned up in a silent silver car at Ripperstone Farm too.
Yes, yeah, I'm not so sure about that one. I think that was the famous Ripperstone Farm story that we could have an entire program talking about, where there was like a semi-fictional book that was written on the events at Ripperstone Farm, and it was basically where do I even start with that one? But a guy did actually come forward in the 1990s who he claimed that he was responsible for some of those sightings of these spacemen that were seen walking around in that area. And he basically obtained a firefighting suit that was used in one of the local, I think it might have been an asbestos factory or something. This was like a huge metal suit with like a visor, dark visor. And it was on display in a local shop. And he, after a night on the drink, borrowed this suit and started visiting some of these remote places where UFOs had been seen.
Oh, no.
And he said he went to a farm, which I think is Ripperstone Farm, and sort of stood outside the window of this farm, because it had been in the news, in the local newspaper, as being a centre of UFO activity. And he had to do a runner, basically, because somebody came out of the farm with a shotgun.
Wow, that's crazy.
Whether that is true or whether he's making it up, I don't know. But I think there was a bit of hoaxing going on, which is exactly what the MOD concluded in their report.
Well, I've got to give a shout out to Dave, because he's very knowledgeable, good friend, part of UAP Media UK, and he finishes up with saying, "Road trip, Vinny, I'll bring the vino." Now we're talking.
Well, it's a beautiful part of the world, and the Welsh Triangle has been forgotten about. No one ever talks about this now. This is one of my beefs with this subject. It's all, whenever we talk about the UK and UFOs in the UK, it's all Rendlesham. And however evidential or not that story is, I think people really are getting tired of it. It's like, you know, Roswell, there's only so much you can say, and there are so many more evidential cases, far more. I mean, even ones that I can't explain, and that's saying something, isn't it?
Yeah, well, you said it.
Yeah, I mean, one that's in the records that I wrote about on my blog, and I think there was a couple of stories in the media about it, is the RAF Trudos sighting or incident from I think about 1984.
Right.
Really, really interesting. And this is one that got interest from the intelligence services. And RAF Trudos is a radar station that sits right on the top of the highest peak in Cyprus. If anyone's ever been to Cyprus or knows Cyprus, you know it's like divided between the Greek part and the Turkish part, and there's
Sure.
there's a British sovereign territory which has been sort of like quite a strategic base for UK forces during the Cold War. And we've got a radar station called Trudos that sits right on the top that monitors that part of the Mediterranean. And there was an amazing sighting, I think in October 1982 or 84, where an American spy plane, a KC-135, I think it was flying over the Mediterranean, obviously monitoring the Soviet Union. And the whole crew saw this lighted object with light spinning around it that was basically buzzing this spy plane, picked up on the spy plane's radar. And the interesting thing was, because the nearest ground radar was this RAF one at Trudos, they got in touch with Trudos and said, look, we've got this UFO that's following us, and can you see it on your radars? And unfortunately Trudos couldn't, and they were what's known as a GCI, ground control intercept, so it's a pretty powerful radar. They were looking for it, couldn't see it, but the spy plane could see it on their airborne radar. And it got to such a stage that two Phantom jets were scrambled from Akrotiri, which is the British base on Cyprus, and there was a US aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean at the time, and they launched some interceptors, and both aircraft were sort of zooming towards the spy plane, still being circled by the UFO. And the RAF crew on Trudos were listening to all the conversations that were going on, and they tape recorded all this, sent it to London for analysis afterwards. And as these jets were coming in to intercept the UFO sort of like obviously saw something was coming, and zoom off it disappeared towards Africa.
Wow.
And this is all there in the files. And I've got some. I managed to get a top secret summary of the incident from the RAF Trudos operations record book, which I think I put online somewhere. It's pretty stunning sort of account of what happened. And I found another memo that basically said this was looked at by the intelligence services, completely sidetracked the UFO desk. They weren't even told about it. It's not even in their files.
Wow.
Which again just shows that they just didn't have any part of these investigations. Sent to the Americans, because it was obviously an American incident that we were sort of peripherally involved in. And all this stuff that's been going on with the Pentagon report and this, the UAP task force, I'd like to see whether this forms part of what they're looking at. I suspect it doesn't, because the report said they're not looking at anything before 2004. But somewhere,
no, I think that even it was just, there was one case at 2004, the Nimitz, and I think after that it jumps right up to sort of 2014, 2015 with Navy cases from Naval Base Oceana off of the Florida coast, and obviously a few things off of the West Coast as well. It was very precise areas and times. So yeah, I doubt they were looking at it at all.
So what's happened to all this earlier stuff? Because their position at the time, the Americans, was, after Project Blue Book closed in 1969, we were not interested in.
I think the information's out there within all the different agencies, but I think when the UAP task force were given 180 days to collate information and report on it, they were very, very limited with staffing, timescales. We had the midst of the pandemic. They had pushback from multiple agencies for actually gathering the information they were entitled to. I think there were many aspects of it that really stopped them from formulating a better report. I mean, we don't know what the classified report had, but we know that the public preliminary assessment was very limited with data. So, it's hard to say.
But and again, this is where DI55 are quite interesting, because we're told, aren't we, that this what was it originally called, the AATIP task force thing that we originally told had come into existence. I think about, was it 2000 when was it, 2006 or 2007 or something?
Yeah, there's a bit of conjecture about that, but yeah, 2007, 8, that kind of time. But
I know for a fact, having spoken to some of these DI55 people, that that's nonsense. They were talking to another organization that was doing effectively that in the 1990s, during the period in which they said they didn't have any formal interest in the subject. And I'm this is something I'm looking into at the moment, but there was one occasion where I think in 1992 or 1993, two DI55 officers who had UFO responsibilities flew to Washington for a conference with Defense Intelligence Agency, CIA, and various other agencies that were actively investigating UFOs at that time. And they were sharing information that the DI55 had collected.
I've heard the rumors, but there's no data. I can't say anything about it, to be honest. I've heard little bits and bobs, and it's just, you can't research it. There's nothing,
and they're obviously
available.
The information's obviously there, but they just won't release it, and we may have to wait another 50 or 60 years, but by then they'll probably have destroyed it.
Maybe. I'm just going to take a moment to reiterate that there's a couple of people asking questions. I'm going to save them towards the end of the interview, so don't worry, I will get to it. I really appreciate that. Now, I've got a document up still. I don't know if it's still relevant to what we're talking about.
This is my favorite one. Yeah, the one from 1995.
Let me make sure it's that one then. No, I've gone past it then.
It's the one that says "ouch" on it. Somebody scribbled the word "ouch" in the margin.
Right, let me just share the screen and you can tell me.
Yeah, no, you've gone right to the end now, Vinny. So if you go back a bit, we got to Ron Haddo, didn't we?
There we go.
Yeah, so this is written by the UFO desk officer in DI55, and this is the bit where he is trying to persuade his boss to give him some information to set up this computer database. And but I've got to read this because to me this says it all. People want to know the truth about what went on, how they studied this subject. And he basically says to his boss, for many years, various UFO groups have associated DI55 with reports of unidentified flying objects. Indeed, I have several books at home that describe our supposed role as defender of the Earth against the alien menace. It is light years from the truth. And then he says, I see no reason for continuing to deny that DI55 has an interest in UFOs. However, if the association is formally made public, then the MOD will no doubt be pressured to state what the intelligence role / interest actually is. And this is the killer line. This could lead to disbelief and embarrassment, since few people are likely to believe the truth that lack of funds and higher priorities have prevented any study of the thousands of reports received. Now, someone, I think this guy's immediate superior, has put a little mark, which you can see in the margin there, and written the word "ouch" with an exclamation mark. So basically what he's saying is, we've been collecting these reports for years. We're under so much pressure because we've got so much work on, and anyone who works in the civil service will understand this, or in the military, that basically this is him talking. I've got this massive pile of things I've got to do every single day I come in. I've got to keep an eye on what the Russians are doing with the latest aircraft technology. I've got to keep an eye on what they're doing with the ballistic missiles. And then I've got this pile of UFO reports sitting on my desk. And I've spoken to the guy who wrote this memo, and he said, I used to come into London by train every morning. I'd go into my office, and there'd be a brown envelope sitting, sent by Nick Pope or whoever was doing the UFO desk job. Every single day there would be sometimes 30, 40 incidents to look at. I've only got like however many hours in the day.
Yeah.
So you'd just get them out of the envelope, have a look through them. Right, okay, stick them in the file. And that would be the extent of the investigation, because they had no money, no time, no resources. And that's effectively what he's saying there. And he was writing that before freedom of information. He never suspected that we would be sitting scrutinizing his words tonight. And that is the truth, the inconvenient truth. That if anyone was properly invested, if anyone is the real Men in Black, it was them. But they didn't have the time, they didn't have the money. It was all a big pain in the bottom for them that they wanted to get rid of it, basically. It was embarrassing to them. And because they were a secret agency, they were embarrassed about all the publicity that they were getting. You know, this thing about the defender of the earth against the alien menace. Like, you know, it was like they'd be thinking, you know, the last thing we want is the Russians to start coming sort of using the UFO subject to sort of find out who it is who runs DI55 and finding out where they live. You know, you see where I'm going with this. You know, Absolutely. It was something that they were extremely embarrassed about. And so what was the conclusion of the Condign Report? What was Ron Haddo told? He was basically told, here's some money, go off, produce this database, muck about with it. We know you're interested in the subject. You know, you can have a few years paid studying it. Don't bring any attention to yourself, but you can say whatever you like about the subject as long as it says DI55 no longer need to be interested or study UFOs anymore. So as long as you can say that it's the Jolly Green Giant that's sending UFOs, we don't care, as long as your main recommendation is that Defense Intelligence no longer needs to see these reports or spend any more time on them. And lo and behold, that's the conclusion of the Condign study, which you can see if we go a bit further along.
Yeah.
And that, folks, is how the government spend our money.
It opens up so many questions, though. It really does.
Yeah. I mean, that top paragraph there, I think that's in the introduction. That's the one where you know, if you're looking for evidence of government interest in the subject, it actually says there's no doubt that these things exist. They are spherical, disc, cigar-shaped. They occur on a daily worldwide basis. There's a line there that says that UAP exists is indisputable. Now that is a killer line, isn't it?
It's huge.
Credit the ability to hover, land, take off, accelerate to exceptional velocities and vanish. They can reportedly alter their direction of flight suddenly and clearly can exhibit aerodynamic characteristics well beyond those of any known aircraft or missile, either manned or unmanned. Now, that to me is amazing. That is a British intelligence study conclusion. I mean, you can stick your Pentagon report. This is I mean, all that fuss, and what did we get? 6 pages of from the Pentagon that said virtually nothing we didn't already know. You know, if you want to read really in-depth stuff, look at the Condign study. You know, you've got a very clear conclusion there. Basically, these things exist, and we don't have a clue what they are. That to me is an amazing discovery. So when I read that in 2006, you know, my sweaty hands was all over these things. I just thought, this is amazing. You know, wait until ufology is going to sort of like be amazed. And the reaction I got was, oh, it's not aliens. We're not interested.
Wow, that's crazy.
And the media, the way the media covered it, it was, oh, it's all a big ball of gas, big load of hot air, you know, the plasma thing. So the plasma thing just turned people off. People didn't want to hear about plasmas. Plasmas aren't sexy. We want aliens. You know, if it's not aliens, then it's all a whitewash and a cover-up. But that really is throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is what we should have got in 2021 from the UAP Task Force report. That kind of statement, that paragraph would have been better than 6 pages.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think if you go a bit further, you'll get to the conclusions. So this is quite interesting. Summary of findings. So what he says there, based on all the available evidence remaining in the department reported over the last 30 years. I mean, a lot of the evidential sort of sightings from pilots and things he didn't see because they'd all been destroyed. Yeah. The earlier reports from the 50s, but he says. Causes of UAP reports, and if you compare what he says here to what's in the Pentagon study, it's basically he could have written it himself. It's like
Yeah.
misreporting of man-made vehicles, often observed by perfectly credible witnesses, but with unfamiliar or abnormal features or in unusual circumstances. Reports of natural but not unusual phenomena, which are genuinely misunderstood at the time by the observer, like flocks of birds, sundogs,
Sure.
that kind of thing. And then we get to the meat, the incidence of natural but relatively rare phenomena, and these may be increasing due to natural changes and possibly accelerated by man-aided factors such as smoke and dust. So he's talking about these dusty plasmas.
Yep.
So he then says there's no evidence to associate the phenomena with any particular nation. So he's saying there's no evidence it's the Russians or the Chinese. No evidence to suggest the phenomena are hostile or under any type of control other than that of natural physical forces. And evidence suggests that meteors and their well-known effects and possibly some other less-known effects are responsible for some UAP. So this is this bizarre idea that like meteors impacting on the upper atmosphere, that they get this sort of buoyant plasmas that can sort of survive for lengthy periods of time, can drop towards the earth, and this is what has been seen by pilots and possibly even by people on the ground.
Yep.
And I'm sorry, it's nonsense. Nice idea, but no cigar.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd rather go with aliens, I'm afraid. I think there's more evidence of that than there is dusty plasmas. But, there you go. Is there another page?
There is.
Of conclusions.
Start there.
Yeah, that's the key bit there. Study recommendations. This is what I was talking about. So the key recommendation, this is the only one the MOD acted upon, because he made a lot of other recommendations about... because there was a lot of stuff about near collisions between UAPs and civil aircraft. He did a whole sort of database study of unexplained cases where RAF aircraft had crashed and there was no explanation. And he actually tried to see if there was any correlation between those unexplained aircraft crashes and sightings of UAPs from the computer database. All the recommendations from that, they just ignored. The only one they were interested in is this one here. It should no longer be a requirement for DI55 to monitor UAP reports. So that's basically what he was told to say and come up with. And as a result of that, DI55 then wrote to the SecAS and said, don't send us any more of those UFO reports. So they effectively removed themselves from the MOD's formal UFO sort of study. So what remained of the UFO desk carried on, trundled on, with the famous answer phone for another 9 years. The RAF component, the radar people, they were on board until 2009, and then we had the financial crash under Gordon Brown, massive cuts, and someone somewhere said, why on earth are we paying someone to have an answer phone for people reporting UFO reports? We're not interested in what the public see. All we're interested in is there anything on radar that we can't identify, because that is something we need to worry about. So they just said, shut it down. It's just causing us a lot of hassle, because simply having a UFO desk and a UFO hotline invites people like me and you, Vinny, to hassle them and say, send us what you've collected. Did you get a report about this? Did you get a report about that? And then they have to pay someone to respond, which is costing them money, which they don't want to spend. So they just shut the whole thing down. Now, I've since learned that the DI55 no longer exists. So, and I think that is a direct result of all this business coming out about their interest in UFOs. I think it's become such a well-known term, even though 74% of your people who are tuning in tonight have never heard of DI55. It's all over. It's been all over the media for years that they were the UFO investigation agency for the MOD, and I just think it's embarrassing. So they've just made it go away. They've disappeared it.
Yeah, we're actually now up to 81% is now no.
Yeah.
So it's getting.
Now, I have absolutely no doubt that there is an agency that used to be called DI55 that is still investigating UFOs. They just called it something different and moved it somewhere else in the MOD.
That was just about what I was going to ask you. Exactly that question. Do you think they've evolved into a new, again, like we've seen it so many times, change the name, and that's it.
Absolutely. So, yeah. And a good way of hiding something from freedom of information, even though they've completely hobbled freedom of information anyway, they can now say, sorry, we can't respond to you because of COVID. That's the latest excuse. You know, we can't go looking through these files because it's dangerous because there might be COVID in the files. That honestly, that is what they're saying now. But I think they're hiding it. Maybe they're using contractors from private industry to do this so that they can say, oh, this is not something the MOD are doing. True, you know, because we're paying someone else, a private contractor, to do it on our behalf. But they've definitely got some agency that's looking at the more evidential sightings and all these sort of statements that they make about we're not following the Americans. I don't believe it for a minute.
I completely agree. I absolutely completely agree. And I've done 0.01% of the research compared to what you've done with regards to the digging in the files. And I mean, I spent many years ago back in the National Archives, I think 2013, you know, after 2008, 9, 10, and when they were dropping them regularly those years, I dug through all of those, but I didn't do what you did and put together a database and start linking threads and stuff like that. I mean, that's serious work. And
but what I would say, you know, this computer database that they used to create the Condign Report, they destroyed that because I tried to get hold of the hard drive. I actually made a Freedom of Information request for the Excel spreadsheet, which you're quite entitled to do, that they'd actually used. And it turned out that he'd been asked to destroy it. So after spending all that time and money actually inputting God knows how many 100,000 reports from 1987 to 1997, he scrutinized it and produced all this sort of data and then destroyed it.
But doesn't it make sense that DI55 and a lot of their data and information then went on to this new, whoever they are, they probably have it, whoever they are, and then DI55 got rid of everything. So in what we see, it is gone, but maybe it's not.
But the thing is, what I should say about the data that was inputted, you must have heard the phrase, if you put rubbish in, you get rubbish out of a database.
Of course, yeah.
Well, again, despite what Nick Pope says, I mean, if you look at you only have to go and look through some of those documents, Vinny. You've seen them, haven't you? You open those files.
I've got loads. I photographed stacks.
Well, just look at any of those individual so-called sightings. The quality of them is appalling. You've got like this standard questionnaire, haven't you? A, B, C,
D. Yeah. Oh yeah. I've got the forms
with a standard letter. To the person who made the report saying, thank you for your citing, standard sort of go away and don't come back sort of thing. And I would say, I mean, from the ones that you've seen, were there any that had showed any evidence of being properly followed up as opposed to just looked at and put in a filing cabinet?
No, absolutely none. But I mean, there were some very compelling cases, but all it was a lot of people writing in with pictures, drawings, things they'd seen, statements, really in-depth statements, multiple witness statements, but zero evidence that they were looked into by anyone within DI55 or the intelligence community.
They weren't. The only ones that were followed up were the ones, occasionally ones reported by military witnesses. So the point I'm trying to make is when he was inputting all this stuff into his Excel spreadsheet, all the data was useless because no one had investigated it. So what he was inputting, lots of it, most ufologists would accept that in terms of like the numbers of UFO reports, raw data, people seeing lights in the sky, briefly seeing objects in daylight, anyone who is investigated and followed them up will know that 90 to 95% of that raw data is IFOs. You can easily identify what's seen if you do an investigation. As they didn't investigate, all that data that Ron Haddo inputted into his Excel, 90% of it was noise. Therefore, the conclusions he reached, I mean, this is basic scientific methodology. I get students doing this kind of thing all the time. if the student had gone off and done something as poor as that, it would have failed. It's not scientific, and yet he's trying to make it out it was some sort of a scientific study. It wasn't science. It was totally methodologically flawed. So
Right.
because all the data that's coming in is inputting is noise, therefore what's coming out the other side in terms of analysis and scrutiny is useless, because it's based upon masses of different things like birds, meteorites that were never properly investigated in the first place.
Of course.
So it's great that he did the study, and it's great that he reached the conclusion that there are things that can't be explained, but the actual methodology he used was totally flawed. And what I'd like to do is, because all that data that he used has survived, that raw data, what I'd like to do is set up a duplicate of his Excel spreadsheet, input all that data again, and then rerun the program. And I bet you anything, you'd come up with far better conclusions than he did.
Yeah, makes absolute sense.
That's a job for someone. If you want a research project,
I mean,
we'll give you a code name. And the interesting thing is Condign. Now, people ask, what does Condign mean? And I asked Linda Unwin this when I went to collect the report. Why did you choose Condign? And because there's similarity with Condon, the University of Colorado report, the Project Blue Book.
Of course, the end of Blue Book, yeah.
Yeah, and she just said, we use code words all the time, and they're just randomly generated by computer. And I thought, really? But why this particular one?
Yeah.
So I looked in the Oxford English Dictionary for what the word condign means, and it actually means a severe beating, well deserved. Now, whether by coincidence or not, if you think about what the people who are running these things actually thought about it, this is something we don't want to be drawn into. This is something that's been hanging over us for the last 50 years. It's a pain in the butt. We want to get rid of it. It's strange then that they codenamed the project Condign, which means a severe beating, well deserved.
Wow.
Coincidence?
Says a lot.
They're still being beaten now, and I think they deserve it as well, because I think the way that they've gone about trying to conceal their interest in this subject, and the fact that destroyed swathes of paperwork on the subject, that a lot of this speculation that goes on about what went on with the Rendlesham incident, what went on with this thing in the 1950s, the Bexley Heath thing that you were talking about.
Sure. Yeah.
The fact that they've magicked all this stuff away and hidden it and destroyed it has simply increased people's suspicions of why they did that. So effectively they've fashioned the baton with which the ufologists are now hammering them over the head with. It's their own fault through their own paranoia and incompetence. And that's the inconvenient truth of the matter.
Yeah, totally. I'm going to jump to a couple of points that I've just highlighted here from the chat throughout the last hour and a half. My good friend Steph, a shout out to Steph, is saying, ask about the Sheffield 1997 Howden Moore case.
Yeah.
He was actually, I met Steph a few years ago. He's actually a good friend of mine. He was underneath that UFO, very close, and he always told me about it. And so shout out to you, Steph. I'd love to know more.
Something happened. Yeah. Again, I was working on the local paper at the time, and there was a load of reports, sonic booms that were heard. I got questions. I managed to persuade my MP at the time, Helen Jackson, to get questions in Parliament about it. And basically, something went on. It was some kind of military exercise. It's illegal to break the sound barrier over land. And yet they were up to something that day, whether they were pursuing something, whether it was an exercise that went wrong. But something happened. Nothing crashed. There was all kinds of ludicrous claims made about stuff that had gone on, things falling into reservoirs and things. But I interviewed, I think there was a WPC who had a really close sighting of this thing, and she said it was an aircraft. She saw it really close. It looked triangular because it was all lit up bizarrely at night. But there was no doubt it was some kind of military exercise that was covered up, and that was what they admitted. They had to literally drag it out of them. But it's like this thing I was reading about on Facebook the other day. Have you heard about the Pentridge incident?
And Turk, yep.
On it in Wales. I know nothing about it. It sounds very similar.
Military exercise.
Yeah, some kind of military exercise. Yeah.
Yeah, the Sheffield case I tried to look into a few years ago, and all I could find that it was cited from sort of North Derbyshire into South Yorkshire. There was very scant information, nothing that stood out to really say anything to me, you know. So I never formed a conclusion. So yeah, great, Steph. I don't know if that's what you wanted to hear or not, but there you go.
Yeah, it's one of the most puzzling cases in the files. But like I was saying about some of these others, you never get to hear about them because all anyone wants to talk about is Rendlesham.
Of course, yeah. Let's move on to Campbell. Campbell, thank you for the $10 donation. Campbell says, Dr. Clarke, as a professor of folklore, can you share some of your thoughts about the role that belief and cultural context plays in shaping eyewitnesses' descriptions of UFO encounters?
Yeah, this is a really good one. Yeah, I mean, I should explain that, like, people often think that when I talk about the subject in the context of folklore, and I sort of say it's folklore, it's like people think that I'm dismissing it by saying it's only folklore, which isn't what I'm saying at all. Folklore is simply people's stories and beliefs and traditions, and whatever UFOs are, what I'm interested in as a folklorist is the stories. You know, how people tell those stories, what these experiences that clearly are real, that happen to them, that I'm not dissing that at all. There are people who are lying and hoaxing. There's always been people. Think of the people who reckon they'd been to Venus in the 1950s, George Adamski. Either he was delusional or he was lying or whatever. There's always been that. But I'm interested in all of it, including the contactee stories, because they're all part of like a cultural phenomenon, which UFOs actually are. And what I'm doing there is not stepping back from what they actually are to how people have written about them, how they've interpreted them, how it's had that impact on their lives. And that's what folklore studies. So I think none of us know what is really at the heart of the UFO phenomenon. I despite being a skeptic, I wouldn't have spent 30 years of my life immersed in this subject if I thought it was a load of nonsense and there was nothing there. But there's only so far you can go with that. And as a folklorist, I've just thought it's far better not to engage with whether it's true or false, because what's true or false? What might be true?
Absolutely.
You know, I'm more interested in what these things are in terms of how people tell stories about them and how those stories evolve over the years. So that's what I mean by it's folklore. There's no doubt it's folklore. It's modern folklore. I don't know whether that answers the question, but I got a lot of flack, and I still get a lot of flack over something I said on some TV program somewhere about triangular UFOs, that no one saw triangular UFOs before Star Wars.
I had a comment about that, and it wasn't very
the
nice.
Imperial Star Destroyer. What people need to understand about these TV programs is that you go in and you film. You know, the recent Channel 5 one that I did. I in a freezing cold studio in London for, I think it was like 2.5 hours being interviewed for that program. And if you watched it, they probably used less than a minute of what I said, heavily edited. So when you hear people talking on these programs, the producers and directors have just cut tiny little snippets out of it and often introduced. They always have me and Nick Pope, like me, I say a little bit and then Nick Pope gets 5 minutes, then I get 30 seconds, then it's Nick Pope. And the way it's presented, you're often quoted completely out of context.
Of course.
All I was saying in terms of like Star Wars and the cultural side of it is simply that you can't ignore the fact that there is a relationship between how UFOs and spacecraft and what have you are depicted in popular culture, i.e. in films, TV, books and magazines, and what people actually say they see.
Yeah.
Because if you go back to the 1940s and 50s, if you saw an object in the sky you couldn't identify, it was a flying saucer. It was saucer-shaped, disc-shaped. That's what people thought was the next big leap in aerodynamic technology after the jets of the Second World War. That's what was being depicted on all the 1950s B movies like The Day the Earth Stood Still, Earth versus the flying saucers, etc., etc. I mean, people were seeing cigar-shaped objects and spheres, but the media created this image of the flying saucer. And then by the time we get to the 1970s, lo and behold, no one wants to see flying saucers anymore. All these things are triangular shaped. Now, you can't get away from the fact that from about the 1970s onwards into the 1980s, we got all these cultural images of triangular shaped spacecraft. X-Files, the very first episode, I know it was 1993, Mulder breaks into that air base, doesn't he? And he sees this triangular shaped thing that comes over him and beams down on the floor. You've got, as I said, you've got the wedge-shaped Imperial Star Destroyers from Star Wars, and at the same time, you've got the images of the F-117 stealth fighter, the B-2 bomber, and there must be a connection between those images of what a flying saucer should look like, UFO should look like, and suddenly people seeing lots of triangular objects. And now we've grown tired of triangular objects. We're now seeing things that are tic-tac shaped and pyramid shaped. And when I was involved in that American series, what was it called? The Unidentified? And I was filming at the National Archives for that.
Unidentified. With TTSA and Lou Elizondo.
Honestly, I struggled to watch some of these shows, but I sat through, I think, 2 episodes of it, and I felt like I was being hammered over the head by someone telling me, UFOs are tic-tac shaped. It was over and over and over again. And now people are seeing tic-tac shaped objects. Is it any wonder that that's what they're being described as? So you can't get away from that sort of cultural.
No, you can't. And I get that. But I mean, I think what people probably read into that snippet was that is what you were focused on. That is all you were saying. And there was no wider context that the TV show didn't show. And I'll just take this moment to remind everyone in the chat to please keep it nice and polite. We're all about different opinions, but if you start throwing out a bit of shade, you're going to get blocked. This is about mature conversation, and we can have differences of opinion, but keep it polite, please. So I'm just going to jump to these last 3 questions I've got here from my colleagues at UAP Media UK.
Okay.
So the first one comes from Graham Rundell.
Graham. Hello.
He says, how does Dave think the UAP subject is going to develop over the next few years?
Ooh, well, I'll get my crystal ball out, shall I? Interestingly, good question. I think it's all going to be focused around what becomes of this Pentagon investigation. And I really think that they've set themselves up for a huge fall in doing what they've done. I think effectively what we're going to see is a rerun of Project Blue Book, because I know they're trying to sort of keep out of the limelight. And honestly, the acronyms, the last statement they made, I counted, it must have been about 12 acronyms, increasingly lengthy. I don't know if they're doing that to throw us off the scent or what, to make it even more complicated than it already is. But at some stage, because they've got all this Senate interest in the subject and massive sort of media scrutiny, they are going to have to come up with something. And that
absolutely
pathetic report that they produced last summer, they are going to have to at some point do a proper summary of what they found. And no, they can't do what the British did with the Condign thing and say, oh well, it's a low priority thing. Some guy inputted a few things into an Excel spreadsheet. They've spent millions of dollars, tax dollars on this. They're going to have to come up with something better than that. I mean, and I read that report and it's so amateurish. This is a Pentagon report. Honestly, a work experience student could come up with something better. So I just think we're going to see a rerun of what they're going to do is they're going to reach the same conclusion that all the other studies in the past have reached. Something's going on, but we don't know what it is, and they're going to have to throw that back, and then people are going to be they're going to be in disbelief, aren't they? And we're all going to be saying, what about the Nimitz incident? Didn't you do a proper study of that? And we already know they didn't. Even though that was in 2004, if you read that report by the US Navy, which is actually one of the most interesting documents of all, do you know the one it's about 16 pages?
I know it very, very well. Yeah,
it's so embarrassing because they basically say they had all these fantastic radars, but they weren't using the right ones, and they couldn't keep the object on radar, and this radar was in the wrong place at the right time, and another one was in the right place at the wrong time, and no one sent an email reporting this up the chain of command because everyone was standing around with like tinfoil hats on, taking the mickey out of the pilots. I mean, this is like, you know, the only superpower in the world, and that's the best they can do. Yeah. Again, I think they finally realized that the ridicule and the taboo side of it, which has been actually discouraging people. In fact, that's the only significant thing in the Pentagon report to me, was the fact that they've acknowledged the fact that they basically need to take this seriously, and people who see these things, particularly military pilots and that, rather than taking the Michael out of them, they need to have a very clear reporting channel, so they can report what they see in real time, and it goes to the right person, and that it can be investigated immediately. And that's what's been missing for the last 70 years. You know, because by the time it's actually got to somebody like DI55, the trail is cold, the scent has been lost, the hard data, the real-time data. You know, these people are sat looking at radar screens. When somebody reports something, a pilot, they need to be able to sort of immediately correlate that with a target on radar, which is what they're finally saying they might actually get round to doing, if you read that report. About bloody time as well. It's only like 70 years, you know.
Absolutely. I mean, listen, I could have a conversation for another hour about that report and about the cases and stuff, but we'll jump on to Adam's question. Adam Goldsack asks, why do you think the UK and the US have very different approaches to UAP?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think it's because the UK has always been in the shadow of the USA. And if you look at some of the surviving documents, you know, I've said most of the early ones have been destroyed. Yeah. There are a few that have survived. But what you find is that because we've always been short of cash, basically, as a country, if you read some of the memos and some of the archive material, they actually say, why should we spend money on this subject when the Americans are so better resourced? Why don't we just let them get on with it, see what their conclusions are, and we'll just go along with that? So that, I think, explains the difference in approach. And I think that's the root of it, that we've always been sort of in their shadow. But because the USA have never done a particularly good job either, we've both been chasing each other's shadows, basically. And also there is all these petty rivalries going on, where one country won't share intelligence with another country and all that sort of thing. But I think we've been a bit more open-minded in that after, you know, the US Project Blue Book shut its doors, I think 1970.
69, yeah.
69. Well, that was the opportunity that we had, the British, if we'd have wanted to say, right, that's it, we're going to shut down our project as well. But we didn't.
No.
As you know, because we've just been looking at something
through it, yeah.
Yeah, and to our credit, I mean, I know it was like a tiny amount of money that they spent on it, but, you know, we continued monitoring the subject and doing it very sort of openly as well, and encouraging people to report right up to 2009. So it's interesting that the British sort of interest has sort of like been massive up to about that point, and we've sort of now receded, and suddenly, you know, the American military are where it's all happening, and we're saying it's nothing to do with us anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to bring up this comment here from Beardy Weird. He says, Five Eyes, they share. Now, I'll make a statement on that. Is you'll be surprised how much they don't share. Mm-hmm. I've come across so many things recently in my research where, the 5 countries should be sharing. Yeah, here, have this with the 5 countries. They don't.
No.
They should, but they don't. So it's not as black and white as you might think it is. The final question is from Dave Partridge. He says, can you ask David what he knows about Room 801?
Yes, Room 801. Yeah. Now, I think it was originally mentioned in a very obscure newspaper article, I think in about 1957. I think it was called the Empire News, and they used to run UFO stories. And one of them was that the top secret Air Ministry headquarters was apparently in room 501 of I think it was the Metropole building in Northumberland Avenue in London. I've actually been in this building for one of the documentaries I did about 20 years ago, and we actually went to where 801 was, which was right up in the top, in the attic of this building, and they denied that this was where the Air Ministry UFO investigation office was at that time. And apparently one of their reporters had actually managed to get in there, and apparently there was loads of filing cabinets, and there was a map on the wall with pins stuck in it where related stuff. Now they denied it, and I think there's a letter that I managed to get hold of. Donald Keogh, you remember the American who wrote all those books in the 50s, really big name. Absolutely. He actually wrote to the MOD, and there's a letter in his personal files from them denying that was where the nerve center of effectively, I said DI55 took over in 1967. It was the predecessors of DI55 who were known as DDI Tech, which was the Air Ministry intelligence. And funnily enough, amongst all those thousands and thousands of pages, Vinny, in the National Archives, there was a few from the 1950s that survived. And in one of them, there is an actual message from one of the a memo from one of the Air Ministry intelligence officers to another one, and it's the address on it. I couldn't believe this when I saw it, was room 800, Metropole building. So it was actually the room next door, not 801, 800, and it's actually there in one of the documents, which proves that they were actually right. They're correct. They were based where that newspaper reporter said they were. But from the point of view of the MOD, if they were asked outright, is your UFO HQ in room 801? They weren't lying when they said no, because it was in the next room, 800.
That's amazing. Oh my goodness.
It's a fantastic question. It's really amusing.
Yeah, no, I had to ask
that building's now been sold. It's not an MOD building anymore, which is how I wanted to get into it.
So whatever's going on now somewhere within MOD and Defense Intelligence or whatever, we just don't know where it is.
No.
We don't know what it's called. We don't know where it is, who's involved, or anything.
Yeah, I've got an idea of where it's based, but it's not in central London.
Okay, that's a conversation for another time. Well, David, listen, thank you. I think we've covered all bases here right now. I'm sure we could do this, in a couple of months' time about another subject. So the door's always open. I really appreciate your time. This has been, as always, a fascinating conversation. I think, judging by the viewers and stuff and the numbers, other people have enjoyed it too. So, yeah, thank you so much. We'll have a little chat. We'll have a little chat afterwards. But to everybody that's watching this live, thank you so much. Everyone that's watching on YouTube and listening on the Anomalous Podcast Network, I thank you so much. And yeah, we'll see you in a couple of days for the next one.
Keep watching the skies. The truth is out there. I've just been rewatching episodes of the X-Files, so it's sort of buried itself in my head.
Oh, you have to. You have to. Always necessary. So, guys, take care for now, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.